When people think of risk, they generally look outside their own walls. But what happens when the threat is on the inside? So today we're going to break down how threat management applies to the people on your payroll. So generally when we look at threat management team, an insider risk, we usually we see organizations, they separate the issue, but really it's a behavioral concern. But most organizations, as we see, they separate HR concerns and executive protection and workplace violence considerations. But really, there's a relationship between them all, and that's when BTAM, behavioral threat management, or behavioral threat assessment and management, there we go, kind of come into play. So Jameson, you're our certified threat manager. I would like to hear from you on this tie between insider threat and threat management, especially when we talk about, cybersecurity and behavioral concerns. So please.
Yeah, I mean, and you're absolutely right. Historically, we've had this big wall between insider threat or insider risk, which is focused heavily on cyber-related things, unusual activity, login, access to restricted data. And then we've kept the workplace violence completely separate, when in reality, and the way organizations are starting to lean into this a little bit is starting to see where the overlap is. So, for example, if I have somebody who in the BTAM side of the house is on the pathway to violence, they have a grievance and they're working the way down the pathway to violence, they go through a sequence of understandable escalations before they get to violence. Well, as it turns out, the folks at Carnegie Mellon and all the other folks that have done research on this already said that first maybe 75, 80% of that journey looks awfully a lot alike insider risk, insider threat. There's typically a grievance, there's some escalation, there's some boundary testing, there's some other things. We use different terminology in BTAM, but it's the same unusual or suspicious behavior as they're escalating. And then at some point you hit this magic decision point where somebody will go to an insider risk, say stealing, company protected data, or espionage, or something else, or take the other path and go towards violence or escalation in threats and violence. But if we get that 80%, so there really isn't we should have less of a wall in the middle. We should have more of a conversation about how much the same insider risk, insider threat, and behavioral threat assessment and management. We're dealing with people. We're looking for unusual behaviors, actions, things like that to identify if they're on this pathway. Quite frankly, we speak the same language. We're just looking at different things.
That's one of the beauties of this being a threat management team that is multidisciplinary. When we've been talking about building these teams or when we actually put teams together for clients, it's so crucial that they have that representation from these different functions. We've traditionally talked about legal, HR, or security, right? They're the common ones. But to your point, it's like, well, now we're seeing where cyber or whoever kind of represents IT have a seat at that table as well, because while historically in yesteryear, we might see these issues come up on the computer systems, the people monitoring behavior on the information systems, but it is behavior. Mm-hmm. And that's where it really ties into this. And we're seeing these things come together where the walls are coming down. So like you're saying, regardless of if somebody wants to sabotage an organization, vandalize, have perform an act of terrorism, or even if it is some sort of cyber attack, there is those preceding events. And so bringing all of these players to the table from a multidisciplinary perspective to speak to their expertise really helps get ahead of these kinds of things and hopefully help prevent them.
Yeah, and I think, Jake, you kind of hit the nail on the head here. So I think one of the biggest misnomers, especially for those of us who've worked in the government, cybersecurity, insider threat. This is a major concern. So you're constantly getting your computer-based trainings on, what is an insider threat and all the different types of terrorism, and they're trying to steal secrets. But what we see on the day-to-day in most of the organizations we work with, I mean, this is a real concern, not at that level. So can you guys give me some examples of, some situations that you've heard of or worked with where, there's been clear warning signs, but maybe they were ignored because it's like, maybe this isn't anything, or it's not this big act of terrorism, they're not planning another 9/11. And so, it's like, it can't be an insider threat. They wouldn't do that here. Can you give me some examples of what that looks like in the most common, like, day-to-day organizations?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our clients are now, one, just starting to see the benefit of this. And so where historically these things might not have even been looked at, now these things are brought into the fold. We had one client in particular where they saw the behavior where it was like more interpersonal issues.
Okay.
Right. But they started looking at the wider perspective. And this one, that wasn't necessarily a cyber issue, but when they start looking at the totality of the circumstances, they're seeing the same behavior leak into information systems as well. So it's not necessarily the fact that somebody might be going on to a cyber attack. It still could be the issue of violence, but there's going to be these behaviors that are showing in a myriad of different places as well. So, in this instance, when they're starting to scrape the web, or if they have a partner organization that is looking on the deep webs, the interwebs, as I like to call them, it gives people the full issues of what might be going on with this individual. Because oftentimes, those people that actually pose a threat may not actually make a threat.
Right.
And so we're trying to look at all these issues, and that's part of the benefit of the threat management team here, but also, whether they are going to turn into somebody that decides that their answer to whatever grievance they have is violence, or whether they decide that they are going to try to steal something from the organization. That proactivity allows the organization to get in front of it. Another brief example, this was actually a sabotage version where an organization at utility actually was finding that their water systems were getting poisoned.
Oh, no kidding.
And so same kind of thing here. All the behaviors are there, but this individual was threatening to poison the water for a community. So, there's all of these kinds of different issues where it's not necessarily that it's always going to result in violence, as we've, seen historically, or at least with the clients that we've been working with, that outcome could be, some other type of way they decide to manifest their behavior in a way detrimental to the organization.
No, that helps, explain some of the ins and outs and some things to look for. Jameson, you and I we were just working with a manufacturing company, and I mean, on a much smaller scale, but if somebody has a grievance that they're forming against this company, and they're working on these big elaborate machines, I mean, the potential for sabotage is there, to where it's just like, now you just cost the company, if you sabotage something in the production line, I mean, you just cost the company tens of thousands of dollars, and then a whole investigation and all of this stuff trying to figure it out. I mean, that's a real concern.
Yeah, I actually knew somebody. It wasn't work related. It was actually a family friend who worked in a machine manufacturing type environment, very, very high end machine equipment. And somebody had a grievance and decided to take it out on the machines, just like you said, and ruined 3 of their major machines intentionally by putting in the wrong code, the wrong dimensions, however that works. Multi-million-dollar machines offline for weeks, possibly months.
Yeah.
Imagine if that's, you've got a small or medium-sized company that operates a half dozen machines, and half of your production is offline, all because somebody had a grievance. And I will argue until the cows come home that there's likely a lot of leakage, a lot of stuff happening before that happened. And now we've got a multi-million-dollar loss of just the machines, much less productivity and everything else. I mean, to your point earlier, one of the cases I worked with a client was a stalking domestic violence related case. But if we didn't have access, as a client didn't do the extra step of looking into internal communication channels like instant messaging, we would have lost a lot of the threat signal that we were looking for. There was a lot of significant stuff in just two-way communications that historically, when I was on threat assessment management teams, we wouldn't even have access to that, much less know the team on the other side of this large company that would be able to get us that information. We just wouldn't talk. Imagine a domestic violence where we have so much risk to our organization and not having any insight into how they're communicating with each other and the kind of threats there was. I mean, it's terrifying. So,
Well, and I think that's an excellent point. And we hear a lot from the organizations we work with when we're trying to set up this threat management team. And we preach so much about, make it multidisciplinary, include HR, include communications, include legal, include security. But oftentimes we hear, well, I just want to keep this in-house, in our department, in security. But it's like security might see some probing concerns. But HR might see some disciplinary concerns or this change of behavior that people are reporting. And then you might have, your cyber team that's noticing, I don't know, maybe some leakage there or suspicious activity. But if all of those teams don't communicate and bring all of those concerns to the table, you might have, the whole other half of that gets missed. So it's so important when you're setting up these threat management teams, make them multidisciplinary, include as many departments, that are applicable to your organization. Any other final thoughts on this topic?
I'm just curious, Jameson. So, what our clients largely, we've worked with them to build a threat management team to deal with the issue of violence. I'm just curious, like, what would you say for an organization that wants to kind of make that expansion into covering broader insider risk? Like, how do they, what would be that initial step they could take?
yeah, I think, and I think that's the trend. I think we'll see that over the next 5 years is this merging of what we traditionally thought as insider risk, cyber, everything else, with threat assessment and management into an overall insider risk, insider program that includes violence, and then all the other range of disruptions that could be posed internally. What happens is that I think we always, depending on the type of organization, we either get focused on external threats or internal threats, and we don't know how to change direction. So if we're customer facing, we get a lot of external cases, and they get really good at exercising that muscle. But then when they get something internally, they're like, well, I haven't really dealt with this much. Now we've got our organization's a family. We would never have a risk internally until it does. And so I see all of that coming together to say, let's make sure we're not just have blinders on internal or external. Let's make sure we merge those programs. And I think we're starting to see it now. We're getting more inquiries on it about how to make sure to bring all of it. So it's not two sides of the house, it's the one house. And we just have, we brought in that team, like you said earlier, to include all those stakeholders so we can talk about things, everything from espionage and risk and everything else the way we did traditionally on insider risk and violence. We bring it all together. So I think we'll see that a lot more.
I love that.
Well, thank you, team. I appreciate you shedding some more light on this topic and kind of, explaining how insider threat and threat management kind of has this relationship between the two components and, talking about behaviors and all of that. If you like what you've heard here or you want to learn more, please go to cpps.com. If you want to reach out, just maybe follow up with some questions. We'd love to answer any questions you have for us or provide any resources that we have on this topic. Subscribe to our newsletter as well, the Centerfold. You can do that on our website as well. And this is constantly an ongoing topic, so we just barely scratched the surface. So thank you for joining us.